Hi Class T, it's time to continue our reading of Mr. Penguin and the Fortress of Secrets. And today we are going to be starting with Chapter 9, which is titled Schneedorf on the Peak. Riding on the back of a walking clockwork sleigh was an extraordinary experience. Mr. Penguin found it utterly thrilling to be marched down the mountain, with snow falling on his head, whilst Toe wrigglingly cosy under a thick blanket. The twins, so they were twins, told the adventurers about their village, Schneedorf on the Peak, was one of the highest villages in the world, perched on the side of a dizzyingly tall mountain. There was another mountain across the valley that was taller, but no one lived there. The twins swapped odd looks when the boy said that and quickly changed the subject to the weather. It always snowed in Schneedorf, they said. Mr. Penguin wasn't sure how he felt about that. He liked the idea of snow, but preferred to see it from somewhere warm through closed windows and with a hot fish finger sandwich in his flippers. Being cold reminded him of before he was an adventurer, when he'd lived in the frozen south, with endless miles of empty, freezing, gleaming white coldness. He shuddered at the thought. The village was a lovely, higgledy-piggledy collection of buildings under pretty snow-covered roofs. Wiggly plumes of smoke snaked peacefully from chimneys, and jolly-coloured bunting was strung above the steep, narrow streets. It was so quiet and calm compared to busy Cityville. The sleigh slowed down in a small town square that sloped up at quite a hair-raising angle. Tall, rickety-looking shops and houses stood on three sides, with the most enormous, ornate clock the adventurers had ever seen on the fourth side. Even Colin was impressed. "Wow," said his pad, and Mr. Penguin agreed wholeheartedly. "That's the King Ludwig Vodklonker Memorial Clock," the boy said. "It was built hundreds of years ago to commemorate King Ludwig's skiing skills. He used to come here every winter, and one time he managed a very complicated trick involving several star jumps, a couple of somersaults, and a dance with a feather-edged fan, all in mid-air." "Did he really?" asked Mr. Penguin, amazed. "Oh, yes," said the boy, "and he only broke 6 bones doing it." "We're famous for 3 things," said his sister. "How high our village is, our giant clock, and the international rodent She trailed off, glancing at her brother, who was suddenly looking very glum. Mr. Penguin didn't notice. He was too busy ogling the clock. But Colin jotted down on his notepad. "I look after the clock," the girl said. "Before me, it was our grandad, but it's a bit broken at the moment. The clockwork cuckoo keeps flying out the bottom first, and one of its mechanical eyes won't stop twitching." "But you'll get it fixed, won't you?" said her brother. Her sister nodded, and she pulled the large lever, and the sleigh came to a stop. They were outside a bakery cafe, with warm yellow light spilling from the windows. A pink and white sign above the door proclaimed Frau Strudel's House of Strudel. "And this," announced the girl, "is home." The smell of hot food wafting out of the door made Mr. Penguin's stomach growl. Whilst the sleigh lowered itself, Colin tapped Mr. Penguin on the flipper with one of his spidery legs. He held up his notepad. I think these children are hiding something. What do you mean? Hissed Mr. Penguin. They have loads of layers on. Colin rolled his eyes and scribbled on his pad again. No, I don't mean they've actually hidden something. I think they have a secret. ... But there was no time to ask Colin what he meant. The two children hopped from their seats to help the adventurers out. Colin stashed his pad under the bowler hat. With all this excitement, said the boy, we haven't introduced ourselves. I'm Dieter, and this is Lizzle, said his twin, as Mr. Penguin tumbled headfirst into a snowdrift. He pulled him out and he thanked her, dusting snow off his bow tie. That's Edith Hedge, Mr. Penguin said. On her head is Gordon and this is Colin. Mr. Penguin pulled himself up to his full, not very tall height, puffed out his chest and added, and I am Mr. Penguin Adventurer and Penguin. Dieter gasped, his rosy cheeks draining of colour until they were as white as snow. He staggered backwards against the bakery window. You're Mr. Penguin? Dieter stammered. The Mr. Penguin? From Cityville? Mr. Penguin nodded, feeling less confident now. This was actually who he was. Dieter looked at Mr. Penguin with wide, goggly eyes, then gulped and ran off into the night. To begin with, being famous was exciting. Everyone made an enormous fuss of me wherever I went. Anything I wanted, I could have. Ice cream at midnight, jelly for breakfast, a new pet hamster in a gilded cage topped with a large satin bow. The money came rolling in, but I soon got tired of it all. The constant shows and the travelling left very little room for anything else. I didn't go to school, but I taught myself from books. My favourite subjects were science and engineering. Then I met a world-famous scientist on a ship while I was travelling to the distant east. I snuck into one of his lectures on a boring, rainy afternoon and was surprised to find it thrilling. As soon as we docked, I went straight to the nearest bookstore and bought all his books. After that, I wanted nothing more than to be alone to read them and to lose myself in experiments and inventing things. But every time I look at my books, I had to put them away again to get into costume, have my face smeared with sticky makeup and be pushed out into the spotlight. It made me very unhappy and very, very angry. And that's the end of chapter 9. It's now time for chapter 10. A little light snooping. Nobody knew what to make of Dieter's sudden disappearance. Colin flipped back through his pad until he found the question mark note from earlier and held it up. Well, muttered Mr. Penguin. Quite. Then the door to the bakery flew open, and a very tall woman with rosy cheeks stood there beaming. She was wearing a neat blouse with a pie crust collar and a frilly apron covered with jam splodges. Hello, I'm Helga Strudel Dieter and Lizzle's mother. Welcome to my bakery. Now come in, you must be chilly as snowmen. Everyone shuffled into the warm and allowed this friendly new person to fuss over them, even Colin. "Where's Dieter?" said Helga. Lizel's cheeks turned pink. "Oh," she said, "I think he's just gone to get something. I'll go and find him." Helga nodded at her daughter and turned to the adventurers. "Now I want you to go to the twins' room in the attic and make yourself at home. There are plenty of jumpers there for you to get cosy in. Then come back down here. I'll have fresh cocoa ready and something nice and warm to tuck into. You must be famished." As if on cue, Mr. Penguin's tummy grumbled loudly. He quickly leapt onto the stairs, saying, "That sounds great!" which just about hid the noise. Mr. Penguin and his gang of adventurers trooped off up to the attic. The bakery was a very tall, slim building that wriggled and jiggled this way and that up rickety old staircases. Mr. Penguin decided that if he had to be away from his own cosy home in Cityville, this funny wonky cake shop was the best place to be. Thick, jazzy patterned jumpers were scattered on one of the twins' beds. Within a few minutes, Edith and Mr. Penguin were warmly wrapped in their new knitwear. Gordon was feeling very pleased with himself in his nice new bobble hat. There wasn't a jumper small enough for Colin, but he didn't mind. The cold air wafting through his bushy eyebrow kept his senses sharpened, and he didn't want any knitwear to tangle him up should he have to leap into kung fu action. There was definitely something odd going on here, he said to Mr. Penguin. Said Mr. Penguin, as he turned round in front of a mirror and admired his snazzy sweater. "I think we're all feeling a bit wobbly from our crash landing, but let's have a look around just in case." Mr. Penguin put his flippers onto his hips. He knew it was a bit naughty to rummage around someone's room without asking, but he couldn't resist a bit of a light snooping. The bedroom was full of interesting things. One wall was covered in pictures of engines and motors. Beneath it, tools spilled out from under the bed. "Must be Lizel's side," mused Mr. Penguin, scratching his beak thoroughly. Dieter's side was much more organised. The bed was neatly made, with a tall tower of books, all about hamster training, stacked in size order on the bedside table. On the wall, pinned up in rows, were photographs of a hamster, and of Dieter beaming beside the hamster. Brightly coloured rosettes were dotted between them. "Oh," said Mr. Penguin, "Dieter must have a nice pet hamster." "Yes," said Edith, "that must be its cage over there." "But the cage is empty." Mr. Penguin waddled over to investigate. It had all sorts of tubes and tunnels and viewing platforms. There was even a little hamster-sized sauna on the top level, but there was no hamster. Mr. Penguin whipped out his gigantic magnifying glass and looked very closely at it all. "How odd," he said. "I wonder where it's gone." His eyes fell on a pile of papers beside the cage. Every sheet was full of carefully handwritten notes. Mr. Penguin and Edith couldn't help but peek at them. Edith had to hold them at arm's length as the writing was tiny and she'd brought the wrong specs. Thursday, 9:54 p.m. Lights observed in the fortress and smoke from the chimneys. Friday, 3:26 a.m. Woken by strange whispery hissing sounds seemed to have come from the walls. Friday, 7:22 a.m. Colonel Tuftybum has vanished. He's the 127th one. Friday, 8 a.m. I really miss Colonel Tuftybum. Friday, 11:57 p.m. More smoke and lights from Fortress. Still no sign of Colonel Tuftybum. Mr. Penguin straightened up. Who is Colonel Tuftybum? And what fortress? Just then, an eraser whistled through the air and clunked him on the head. Ouch! He cried. He looked to see where it had come from and saw Colin waving as he dangled from a telescope poking out the attic window. Colin held up his pad. Look through here. Mr. Penguin did as Colin said. He gasped. Through the telescope, he could clearly see a very grim-looking building clinging to the top of the tallest and most pointed mountain, surrounded by sharp, rocky peaks. That must be the fortress, he said, and a shiver went from his hat right the way down his back and into his shoes. What on earth is going on? Suddenly, a great hullabaloo of voices came from downstairs. Edith adjusting her bum bag decisively. I think we should go down and find out. Mr. Penguin gulped. He had a creeping, neck-shivering feeling that whatever it was going to be very dangerous indeed. I soon got terribly bored of my hypnotism act. Night after night I hypnotised the audience to believe they were chickens, so they'd strut and squawk around on stage to make their rich friends laugh. After each show, I felt cross that I was using my hypnotic talent in such a silly fashion. There had to be better things I could do with it. Shortly after my 9th birthday, my diabolical plan began to form. I'd spent the day in bed reading a particularly thrilling and complicated book about radio waves. I was interrupted by a knock at my hotel room door. It was my parents. They were dressed ready for my performance that evening, and they both looked livid. What are you still in your Jim Jams? Cried my mother. You ought to be in costume ready for tonight's show. I protested, pretended to have a headache, and refused to move. There are thousands of very important people coming to see you, said my father. You have to perform. Before I knew what was happening, my book had been snatched from my hand and thrown into the hotel room. Fire. And I was being wrestled into my costume and pushed on stage. Anger bubbled away inside me like a boiling kettle as I stood under the hot stage lights. I felt different, changed. I decided to try something new that night. I wanted to see how many people I could hypnotise at once. I already knew my power worked on small groups, as I often got members of the audience up on stage to conga around. Quite a sight when it involved members of the royal family. But I could hypnotise more. I took off my trademark dark glasses to find out. And that's the end of chapter 10.